Do you know what the White House is? This large house in Washington, D.C. is the home and office of the United States President. Now, here is a question few can answer. Do you know who designed it? While many people might know what the White House looks like, few know that it was designed by an Irish immigrant. His name was James Hoban. Even today, much of Hoban's life remains a mystery. Historians have worked hard to piece together as much as they can about Hoban's life. From his childhood in Ireland to his career in Washington, D.C., Hoban is an interesting figure in American history. His life tells us a lot about the early days of the United States of America, when it was a brand new country. This is the story of James Hoban and the people who built the White House.
Hi, young historians. Welcome to another fun episode of Anytime Now. I'm Brooke, co-founder of Honest History. Today we're talking about the White House. And while talking about a building may sound extremely boring, I promise you it's not. See, there was a lot of planning that went into building the big White House we know today. Do you think the people drawing the plans and hammering the nails and painting the building knew they were leaving a mark on history? This episode may be about James Hoban, but it is also about the people who built it and the building itself. A building that is filled with a story that is screaming to be told. As you listen to this episode, make a mental list of the things you found interesting about this episode. When you are done listening, talk to a friend about some of the facts you didn't know and help share this incredible story with your family and friends. Remember, young historians, history stays alive because of people like you. Now, let's buckle up and head back in time to learn more about James Hoban and the White House.
Our story begins in the 1770s in Ireland. James Hoban was working in a workshop, hammering a piece of wood. As a boy, he had trained to be a carpenter and wheelwright on a country estate in County Kilkenny. Hoban walked outside the workshop to get some fresh air and looked at the grand house in front of him. It was 2 stories high, built of blue limestone with large windows. The house was called Dessart Court, and it was the home of a wealthy man named Lord Dessart. Hoban and his family lived in a simple thatched cottage nearby. Dessart's mansion had probably fascinated Hoban. What would it be like to design and build grand houses like Dessart Court? James Hoban was in luck. As it happened, there was a school in Ireland's biggest city that taught young men about architecture, and it was free to carpenters, just like Hoban. The school was the Dublin Society's School of Architectural Drawing. Hoban was just a teenager when he packed his bags and moved to Dublin. Dublin was very different from the country life Hoban knew. Instead of green fields, there were busy streets filled with carts, horses, and people. At that time, Dublin was a growing city, and the drawing school was at the center of activity on the busy Grafton Street. Hoban was excited to start his training. He would be learning about geometry, architecture, and perspective drawing. It didn't take long for Hoban to make an impression on his teachers. In fact, Hoban's drawings won a competition at school. As the winner, he could either take a medal or a cash prize. Hoban thought long and hard about his decision and decided to take the medal. He would be able to show the medal to people. He hoped this would help him get a job as an architect. And you know what? Hoban was right. Soon, Hoban was working on some of the most exciting projects in Dublin. He learned all about building grand stone houses. This knowledge would come in handy in the future. Although Hoban was eager to work, he soon realized that there were limited opportunities in Ireland because he was Roman Catholic. For many years, there were laws called penal laws. These laws discriminated against Catholics in Ireland and Britain. The laws stopped Catholics from holding office, owning land, voting, and teaching their religion. By Hoban's time, these laws were starting to fade away, but Catholics still faced discrimination. Where could Hoban go to find better opportunities? That's when he heard some intriguing news. There was a new country across the Atlantic Ocean. It had just fought a war and won its independence from Britain. What was the new country called? The United States of America. Hoban packed his bags and boarded a ship to begin his next great adventure. He had his eye on Philadelphia, which at that time was the capital of the United States. The young Irish immigrant was determined to find work in his new home. After he arrived in Philadelphia, he ran to a local newspaper office and placed an advertisement in the newspaper. The advertisement read,
"Any gentleman who wishes to build in an elegant style may hear of a person properly calculated for that purpose, who can execute the joining and carpenter's business in the modern taste, James Hoban."
Hoban was not a man to stand still. 2 years later, he had already moved to find his next big opportunity. He settled in the port city of Charleston, South Carolina. Here, he began designing many different buildings, including the city's courthouse. This proved to be a very good move. While Hoban worked in Charleston, the city had an important visitor. Can you guess who it was? It was none other than George Washington, the first president of the United States. The president was on a tour of the South and spent about 8 days in Charleston. One of these days, George Washington happened to meet James Hoban. Hoban made quite an impression on the president. In fact, the Irish architect got George Washington thinking. The government had just set aside land to build the nation's new capital in Washington, D.C. Although the president wasn't looking for an architect at that moment, maybe someone like Hoban would be useful in the future. It turns out he was right. A year later, George Washington was looking for a designer to build a house for the president in Washington, D.C. George Washington had picked a group of commissioners to help organize the different building projects. These commissioners decided the best way to find a designer was to run a competition. People began to send in their drawings and ideas, hoping to be picked for the job. George Washington was happy to hear that James Hoban would be submitting his own ideas to the commissioners.
"Mr. James Hoban was strongly recommended to me by several gentlemen of South Carolina when I was there last year,"
Washington said. The commissioners looked through 9 different designs. One stood out from the rest. It was a drawing of a grand country house made of stone. A stone house, they thought, would impress the European rulers across the Atlantic Ocean. But the stone house wasn't so grand that it looked like a palace for a king. That was exactly what the commissioners were looking for. When they showed the design to George Washington, the president saw the name of the designer. It was James Hoban, the same architect he had met in Charleston.
"Mr. Hoban has made very favorable impressions on us,"
the commissioners said. Washington agreed. It was an easy decision.
Hi, young historians! Time for a quick break from this amazing story to tell you a bit more about honest history. If you're enjoying this episode, then you'll love Honest History's magazines and books. Each one is filled with important adventures through the past, like the story of Chen Yisao, a Chinese woman who commanded one of the largest pirate fleets in history, to Mansa Musa from Africa, one of the wealthiest people to ever live. You can pick up a copy or subscribe and receive 3 issues delivered straight to your doorstep every 3 months. Just go to honesthistory.co and use code ANYTIMENOW for a 10% discount. That's honesthistory.co and special promo code ANYTIMENOW. Okay, let's get back to the story.
In 1792, James Hoban received the exciting news. He had won the competition. The Irish architect would design the president's house. Have you ever been to Washington, D.C. or seen pictures of it? The city rests along the bank of the Potomac River. Today, it is bustling with activity, filled with buildings and people. But remember, when James Hoban arrived, there was almost nothing there. Hoban began gathering a diverse group of laborers to build the president's house. There were enslaved and free status Black Americans, as well as Scottish and Irish immigrants. All these workers lived together on a muddy stretch of land in Washington, D.C. Today, this land is known as Lafayette Square. Some of these laborers worked as axemen, cutting down trees in the forests of Maryland and Virginia. Others worked as brick makers, who formed and baked bricks in kilns near the building site. Stonecutters had the difficult task of cutting, carrying, and shipping large stones up the river to the building. James Hoban managed his workmen like a sea captain, instructing them and getting them to work together. In fact, he got the nickname Captain Hoban. Recently, historians have been learning more about the enslaved workers who built the White House. In fact, they have identified the names of over 200 enslaved people who helped cut and lay the stone, brick, and timber. It is important to remember that when the United States was a new country, slavery was still legal in many states. Most of the enslaved workers were hired out from slave owners in Maryland and Virginia, the two states right next to Washington, D.C. 4 of the enslaved workers were owned by the White House's designer, James Hoban. These 4 workers, named Ben, Daniel, Harry, and Peter, worked as craftsmen. For the next 8 years, James Hoban and the laborers built the president's house. In 1800, the second U.S. president, John Adams, moved into the building. He would be the first president to live in the president's house. And the house was a sight to see. It was 2 stories high with 2 rows of large windows. It looked a lot like a grand house in Ireland called Leinster House. There was one big difference that was easy to spot. Unlike Leinster House, the president's house was white. It soon got the nickname the White House. James Hoban thought his job was done. Little did he know that in a little over 13 years, he would have to build the house all over again. Why? Well, because in 1814, the White House was burnt to the ground. See, at that time, the United States was at war with Britain. It all began on August 24, 1814. The British Army had just won a battle in Maryland, a little over 8 miles away from Washington, D.C. News spread that the British troops were marching straight towards the Capitol. The First Lady, Dolly Madison, received an urgent letter from her husband, President James Madison. He told her to leave the White House immediately. People grabbed their belongings and raced out of their homes. Within hours, the roads were packed with carts and wagons full of people trying to escape Washington, D.C. As panic spread, Dolly Madison ordered her staff to save a famous painting that hung in the White House. It was a painting of George Washington. "Save that picture if possible," she cried. "Under no circumstances allow it to fall into the hands of the British." The staff, some of them enslaved workers, grabbed the painting off the wall. The British troops could arrive at any moment, so they quickly cut the painting out of the frame and carried it to safety. Later that day, over 4,000 British troops marched into Washington, D.C. To their surprise, they found that the city was nearly empty. Carrying torches, the troops began setting the buildings on fire. After burning the Capitol building, 100 British soldiers turned to march down Pennsylvania Avenue. They were headed for the president's house. The men burst through the door and stepped into the house. To their delight, they found a feast of food and wine that had been prepared for the First Lady. Soldiers raced up and down the stairs, taking clothing and souvenirs. After they ate and grabbed all they could, the troops lit their torches and set the house on fire. The glow of the fires could be seen 50 miles away. Less than 4 days later, a heavy thunderstorm drenched the Capitol, finally putting out the flames. People gathered to see what was left of the president's house. Only the outside walls of the house remained, blackened by fire. James Hoban was asked to rebuild the president's house. He soon realized that most of the walls were terribly damaged and had to be torn down. For the next 2 years, Hoban oversaw the rebuilding. making sure the house looked just as it had before. Again, immigrants and enslaved workers helped build the new home. This is the White House that stands in Washington, D.C. today. One of the few things left from inside the original building is the portrait of George Washington that the staff saved in 1814. Over the next few years, new additions and changes were made to the president's house. In 1824, the famous front porch, called a portico, was added. 6 years later, the second portico on the north side of the building was finished. These porches provide shade during the hot weather. In 1901, the president's house was officially called the White House. James Hoban spent the rest of his life in Washington, D.C., working as an architect. Although he designed many buildings, the White House is one of the few that still stands today. So, young historians, who built the White House? The president's house was built by hands of Black Americans, many of whom were enslaved, and immigrants. Its Irish designer was an immigrant himself who came to the United States for better opportunities. He was also a slave owner. The White House has a complicated and interesting history. As historians, it is important to tell the full story. Now you know a bit of history that many people don't know, and it's an important bit of history too. We hope that you will share what you've learned today with your friends and family.
Welcome back. I hope you were paying attention and thinking of some fun things you learned during this episode. Here's what I learned: that history can be complicated, but it is important that we learn the whole story to fully understand and appreciate those who came before us. James Hoban came to the United States looking to fulfill his dreams, and he did. He built the house that houses our nation's presidents and their families. But it is important to remember, like this country, the White House is always changing, evolving, and in many ways, becoming new. Or at least getting new additions. The next time you go on a class field trip or visit a historical site with your family, think of all the people necessary to make something as simple as a building. Think of how each person involved made a mark on history, even though we don't know their names. You can make a difference in history just by being yourself and doing what you love. And that is truly amazing. That's all we have for now, but be sure to check out issue 15 of Honest History magazine, A Native Story. You can learn all about America's indigenous history and the people who made this nation great long before the White House was built. See you all next time. This episode was hosted by Amy Miller and written by Heidi Coburn. Production was led by Randall Lawrence. To learn more about this episode, including more about the host, visit us at honesthistory.co and follow along for updates on social media at Honest History.